The doors of the great hall burst open, and every torch along the stone walls seemed to flicker at once. Alira Voss stood in the center of the crowd, her heart pounding so hard she thought the whole kingdom could hear it. Around her, hundreds of pack members had gathered for the choosing ceremony, the night when fate revealed who would stand beside the Alpha King forever. She had not expected to be called forward. She had not expected any of this. Alpha King Kaidan Ashgrove stood on the raised platform above her, tall and unmoving, his golden eyes scanning the crowd like a blade searching for a target. When his gaze finally landed on her, something in his face changed. It was not joy. It was not even curiosity. It was disgust. "This cannot be right," he said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. Alira felt every eye in the room turned toward her. She had grown up in the lower quarter of the Packlands, far from the polished stone floors of the castle, far from the silk clothing worn by the nobles, who now stared at her with open scorn. She wore a plain gray dress. Her hands were rough from years of work in the healing house. She was, by every measure the nobles used, nothing. "Say something," Kaidan demanded, stepping down from the platform. The crowd parted for him, the way water parts for a stone thrown into a still pond. "Tell me this is a mistake." Alira lifted her chin. She would not shrink, not here, not in front of everyone who had already decided she did not belong. "I did not ask for this bond," she said quietly. "Fate chose it, not me." "Fate," Kaidan repeated, and he laughed, though there was no warmth in the sound. "Fate does not choose a king's mate from the healing house. Fate does not choose someone with no name, no bloodline, no standing." He turned to face the crowd, spreading his arms as if presenting a joke to an audience. "I am the Alpha King of Blackmoor. I lead the strongest pack in the north. And fate expects me to stand beside a girl who scrubs floors and mixes herbs?" A ripple of laughter moved through parts of the crowd, though many others stayed silent, uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Alira felt her face grow hot, but she did not look away from him. "I reject you," Kaidan said, and the words landed like a blow that everyone in the hall could feel, even those who were not bonded to her. "As Alpha King, I reject Alira Voss as my mate. Let it be known throughout Blackmoor that this bond does not exist." Rejection was not a small thing among the pack. It was not a simple refusal, like turning down an invitation to dinner. A rejection cut through the invisible thread that connected two souls, and everyone who carried wolf blood in the hall felt the snap of it, a cold ripple that passed through the room like a gust of wind through an open window. Several people gasped. An old woman near the back covered her mouth with her hand. Alira felt it too, deep in her chest, a tearing sensation that made her knees want to buckle. But she refused to let it show on her face. She had spent her whole life learning how to hide pain, how to keep her expression calm even when everything inside her was breaking. She used that skill now, more than she ever had before. "I understand," she said, and her voice did not shake, though it took everything she had to keep it steady. "I will not trouble you again, Alpha King." Kaidan's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he had expected tears, or begging, or some kind of scene he could dismiss with a wave of his hand. Instead, she simply turned and walked toward the doors of the hall, her back straight, her steps even. The crowd watched her go, some with pity, some with satisfaction, and a few with something closer to confusion, as though they sensed that something about this moment was not quite what it appeared to be. Near the edge of the crowd, a young woman named Mira reached out and grabbed Alira's arm as she passed. Mira had been Alira's closest friend since childhood, the daughter of one of the senior healers, and she was the only person in the hall who looked truly frightened for her. "Alira, wait," Mira whispered. "Where will you go? What will you do?" Alira squeezed her friend's hand gently. "Don't worry about me," she said. "I will be fine." "You don't have to pretend with me," Mira said. "I know that hurt you." Alira's eyes flickered, just for a moment, toward the platform where Kaidan stood with his arms crossed, already turning to speak with his advisors, as though the matter was closed and forgotten. "It doesn't matter now," she said. "What matters is what happens next." Mira did not understand the strange calm in her friend's voice, the way Alira spoke as though she had expected this outcome all along. She did not know about the quiet visits Alira had made in recent weeks to the old cottage at the edge of the forest, where a woman named Ophelia Wren lived in exile, a seer whom the pack had cast out years ago for speaking truths no one wanted to hear. She did not know that Ophelia had looked into Alira's future 3 days before the ceremony, and told her exactly what would happen in that hall, down to the words the king would use. "You will be rejected," Ophelia had said, her clouded eyes staring somewhere far beyond the room. "And it will be the greatest mistake this kingdom has ever made." Alira had asked her what she should do. "Let him reject you," Ophelia had answered, "and then disappear, before anyone learns what you truly are." Now, walking out of the great hall with the cold night air rushing to meet her, Alira understood that the moment Ophelia had described was already behind her. The first part of the path had been walked. What came next was up to her alone. She did not go back to her small room above the healing house. Instead, she walked through the quiet streets of the lower quarter, past shuttered windows and sleeping dogs curled in doorways, until she reached the narrow lane where she had lived her entire life. She packed only what she needed: a change of clothes, a small pouch of coins she had saved for years, a worn leather satchel filled with dried herbs and healing supplies, and a single item wrapped carefully in cloth, an old pendant that had belonged to her mother, the only thing Alira had left of a family she barely remembered. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed for a long moment, looking around the small room that had been her whole world. Then she stood, pulled a plain traveling cloak over her shoulders, and walked out into the night without looking back. The guards at the northern gate barely glanced at her as she passed. Why would they suspect anything from a rejected mate slipping away in shame? It was common enough. Rejected mates often left the packlands, unable to bear the humiliation of staying where everyone had witnessed their rejection. The guards assumed she was running from embarrassment, and they let her go without a second thought, exactly as she had hoped they would. Alira walked for hours under the cold light of the moon, following a path she had memorized weeks earlier from Ophelia's directions. The forest grew thicker around her, the trees older and taller than any she had seen near the castle. She was afraid, of course. Any sensible person would be afraid, walking alone through unfamiliar woods in the middle of the night. But beneath the fear was something else, something that had been growing inside her ever since Ophelia had first told her the truth about her bloodline. For years, Alira had believed she was simply an orphan, a girl with no family and no history, raised by kind strangers in the healing house after her parents died when she was very young. She had never questioned this story, because there had never been any reason to question it. But 3 months ago, Ophelia Wren had approached her in the market, her clouded eyes fixed on Alira with an intensity that made the younger woman's skin prickle. "You carry old blood," Ophelia had said, without any introduction at all. "Ember blood. Do you know what that means?" Alira had not known. She had never even heard the name before, but over the following weeks, in secret meetings at the edge of the forest, Ophelia had told her everything, that the Ember Court had once been a great and powerful bloodline, capable of shaping the invisible boundaries that protected pack territories from outside threats, boundaries known as wards. That the Ember Court had been hunted to near extinction generations ago by enemies who feared their power, that Alira's mother had fled to Blackmoor to hide, disguising herself as a common healer, and had died protecting her daughter's secret. "Your blood is the reason the wards around Blackmoor have held strong for 20 years, Ophelia had told her. "Even though you never knew it, even though you never tried, your presence here has kept this kingdom safe. If you leave, the wards will weaken. If you leave in pain, wounded by rejection, they may fail entirely." Alira had asked why she was telling her this now, after keeping it secret for so long. "Because a storm is coming," Ophelia had said, "and you need to decide, before it arrives, whether you want to be a secret weapon that others use without your knowledge, or a woman who chooses her own path." Those words echoed in Alira's mind now as she walked deeper into the forest, farther from the only home she had ever known. She thought of Kaidan's face in the great hall, the disgust in his eyes, the casual cruelty in his voice as he rejected her in front of everyone. He had looked at her and seen nothing but a poor girl unworthy of his attention. He had no idea what he had just thrown away. Part of her wanted to hate him for it. Another part of her, the part that had spent her whole life being underestimated and overlooked, felt something closer to relief. For the first time, she was not bound by anyone's expectations. She was not the quiet healer's assistant, not the rejected mate, not the orphan with no name. She was simply Alira, walking alone under the stars, carrying a secret that could change everything. By the time the sun began to rise, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, Elira had reached the edge of a small clearing, where a modest cottage stood, smoke curling gently from its chimney. Ophelia was waiting for her at the door, as though she had known exactly when Elira would arrive. "You made it," Ophelia said, not as a question, but as a simple observation. "I made it," Elira agreed, exhaustion finally beginning to settle into her bones, now that the danger of the night walk was behind her. "Come inside," Ophelia said. "Rest. Tomorrow, we begin teaching you what you truly are." Elira followed her into the small cottage, and the door closed behind them with a soft, final sound. Outside, the forest stretched in every direction, quiet and still, hiding her from a kingdom that had no idea what it had just lost. Miles away, in the castle at the heart of Blackmoor, Kaidan Ashgrove slept soundly in his chambers, untroubled by dreams, unaware that the woman he had rejected in front of his entire court had already vanished into the night, carrying with her a secret that would soon bring his kingdom to its knees. He would not think of her again for weeks. He had no reason to. As far as he knew, she was simply a rejected mate who had run away in shame, one of many such stories that unfolded, every year, across every pack in the north. He did not yet know that somewhere beyond his borders, the invisible walls that had protected his kingdom for 2 decades were already beginning, ever so slowly, to weaken. He did not know that the woman he had dismissed so easily held more power in her blood than he held in his entire army. And he did not know that the choice he had made in a single careless moment, standing on a platform above a crowd that adored him, would soon become the greatest regret of his life. For now, he simply slept, while far away, in a small cottage, at the edge of an ancient forest, Elira Voss began the first night of a new life, one that no longer had any room in it for a king who had never bothered to see her true worth. 3 weeks passed before anyone in Blackmoor noticed that something was wrong. It began with small things, the kind of details most people would never connect to a single missing healer's assistant. A hunting party, returning from the eastern woods, reported strange howls carrying across the border, sounds that did not belong to any wolf native to the region. A farmer near the northern edge of the territory found his fences torn apart overnight, though no tracks could be found leading away from the damage. A scout stationed at the border outpost swore he had seen shapes moving through the tree line, just past the marked boundary. Shapes that vanished the moment he raised his horn to signal an alarm. Kaidan Ashgrove heard these reports with mild interest and little concern. Blackmoor had faced small disturbances before. Wild animals wandered close to the border sometimes. Overzealous scouts saw shadows where there was nothing at all. He was far more occupied with matters he considered truly important. Trade negotiations with the southern packs, a dispute between 2 noble families over grazing land, and the ongoing tension with Nightfell, the rival pack that had been testing Blackmoor's patience for years, with small provocations along the shared border. He did not think of Elira Voss at all during those first weeks. If anyone had asked him about her, he might have struggled to recall the details of her face. She had been a footnote in his life, a strange accident of fate quickly corrected, and he had moved on from the incident with the same ease he moved on from any minor inconvenience. It was his beta, a sharp-eyed and steady man named Corin Blackwell, who first noticed the pattern that others had missed. Corin had served as Kaidan's second-in-command for nearly a decade, and in that time, he had learned to trust his instincts even when the evidence seemed thin. He sat across from Kaidan in the war room one evening, a wide table between them covered in maps of the northern territories, small carved markers representing pack forces scattered across the parchment. "The disturbances near the border are increasing," Corin said, tapping a finger against a cluster of markers near the eastern woods. 3 incidents in the first week, 7 in the second, 12 in the third. Kaidan looked up from the letter he had been reading, a request from a merchant guild for better protection along the trade roads. "Wild animals," he said, "or Nightfell scouts testing our patience again." "Perhaps," Corin said, though his tone suggested he was not convinced. "But there is something else. I had the border wards inspected 2 days ago." Kaidan set down the letter, giving Corin his full attention now. The wards were not something anyone discussed casually. They had protected Blackmoor's borders for as long as most of the current generation had been alive, an invisible barrier woven into the land itself that kept outside threats from crossing freely into pack territory. No one currently living fully understood how the wards had been created or maintained. They were simply accepted as a permanent feature of the kingdom, as reliable as the mountains to the north or the river that cut through the eastern valley. And? Kaidan asked. They are weakening, Corin said. Not everywhere, not dramatically. But in certain places, particularly along the eastern border, the ward keepers report a noticeable thinning. Things are slipping through that should not be able to cross. Kaidan frowned, leaning back in his chair. The wards have never weakened before, not in 20 years. That's exactly what troubles me, Corin said. Something changed, and I don't believe it's a coincidence that the change began around the same time as your choosing ceremony. The room went quiet for a long moment. Kaidan felt an odd, uncomfortable sensation settle in his chest, though he could not immediately name why Corin's words unsettled him. You think this has something to do with the rejection, Kaidan said slowly. I don't know what to think, Corin admitted, but I sent a rider to speak with the ward keepers in the healing house, since they maintain the oldest records of the border magic. They told me something interesting. They said the girl you rejected, Elira Voss, used to visit them often. Not as a patient, as someone helping with their work. Kaidan's frown deepened. She was an assistant. She mixed herbs and changed bandages. What would she know about wards? That's what I intend to find out, Corin said. With your permission, I would like to speak with the ward keepers myself, and perhaps look into her history a little more closely. Kaidan waved a hand, more out of a desire to move on to other matters than genuine interest. Do as you see fit. I doubt a healing house assistant has anything to do with ancient border magic. But if it puts your mind at ease, investigate. Corin left the war room that evening with a growing sense of unease he could not quite explain. He had known Kaidan long enough to recognize when his king was dismissing something too quickly, and he had learned, through hard experience, that Kaidan's blind spots often came from the same place, an inability to imagine that someone he considered beneath him could hold any real significance. The following morning, Corin visited the healing house himself, walking through the modest wooden building where Elira had once worked. The head healer, an elderly woman named Greta, who had trained Elira since she was a child, greeted him with a mixture of respect and wariness. I've come to ask about Elira Voss, Corin said, once they were seated in Greta's small office, surrounded by shelves crowded with jars of dried herbs and old medical texts. Greta's expression shifted, something guarded, entering her eyes. What about her? I understand she left the Packlands after the choosing ceremony, Corin said. I'm trying to understand more about who she was before that, where she came from, what her role truly was here. Greta was quiet for a long moment, studying Corin's face as though trying to decide how much to trust him. She was a good healer, Greta finally said, gentle with patience, quick to learn, but there were things about her that never quite fit. Such as? She had a way with the old wards, Greta said, not something she was taught, mind you. It seemed almost instinctive. Whenever she walked near the boundary stones at the edge of the healing garden, the old markings there would glow faintly, just for a moment. I never told anyone. I assumed it was simply an odd quirk, nothing worth mentioning to the pack leadership. Corin leaned forward, his interest sharpening. Do you know anything about her family? Her parents? She was orphaned young, Greta said, brought to us by a traveling healer who found her wandering alone near the southern road. The healer said her mother had died of illness, though she never gave many details. We never questioned it further. Orphans were not uncommon in those years, especially with the conflicts along the southern border. What was her mother's name? Greta shook her head slowly. I don't recall that it was ever recorded. If Elira knew, she never spoke of it. Corin thanked Greta for her time, and left the healing house with more questions than answers, but with a growing conviction that something significant had been overlooked. He returned to the castle and spent the following days digging through old records, searching for any mention of a healer traveling with a young orphaned girl decades ago, any mention of unusual bloodlines that might explain what Greta had described. It was in an old, dusty archive room, buried beneath layers of forgotten documents, that Corin finally found something worth bringing to Kaidan's attention. A brief mention, in a record nearly 30 years old, of a mysterious woman who had briefly sought shelter within Blackmoor's borders, before disappearing again just as quickly. The record noted, almost as an afterthought, that the woman had refused to give her name, but that the ward keepers of that era had commented on strange fluctuations in the border magic during the weeks she stayed. Corin brought the document to Kaidan immediately, finding him in his private study reviewing reports from the border patrols. He set the aged parchment on the desk between them and explained what he had learned from Greta and from the archive. Kaidan read the document twice, his expression growing more serious with each pass. "You believe this woman was Alira's mother?" "I believe it's possible," Corin said, "and I believe Alira may carry a bloodline connected to the border magic itself. If that's true, her presence here for all these years may explain why the wards have held so strong, and her absence now may explain why they're beginning to fail." Kaidan set the parchment down slowly, a strange tightness forming in his chest that he did not want to examine too closely. He thought back to the choosing ceremony, to the disgust he had felt looking at a woman he considered nothing more than a poor healing house assistant. He thought of the words he had spoken in front of the entire court, rejecting her without a second thought, without a single moment of hesitation. "If this is true," Kaidan said slowly, "then I made a mistake." Corin did not offer comfort, because he did not believe comfort was what his king needed to hear. "If this is true," he said instead, "then we need to find her, before the wards fail completely, before Nightfell realizes what has happened and decides to take advantage of it." Kaidan stood from his desk and walked to the window of his study, looking out over the castle grounds toward the distant tree line where the eastern woods began. Somewhere beyond that horizon, a woman he had humiliated in front of his entire kingdom was living her life without him, unaware, perhaps, of just how much her absence had already begun to cost the people she had left behind. "Find her," Kaidan said, his voice quiet but firm. "Whatever it takes. I need to speak with her myself." Corin nodded and turned to leave the study, already forming a plan for how to begin the search. But as he reached the door, Kaidan spoke again, his voice lower this time, almost as though he were speaking to himself rather than to his beta. "I saw a healing house assistant," Kaidan said. "I never once considered that I might be looking at someone far greater than myself." Corin said nothing, because there was nothing he could say that would ease the weight of that realization. He simply left the room, determined to find Alira Voss before the consequences of Kaidan's rejection grew any more severe than they already were. Outside the castle walls, far beyond the borders of Blackmoor, the wards continued their slow, silent weakening, and somewhere in the eastern woods, unfamiliar shapes moved closer to the boundary, with each passing night, testing the weakening barrier, waiting for the moment it would finally break. The cottage in the forest had become, over the past weeks, something Alira had never expected to find, a home built on truth rather than pretense. Every morning began the same way. Ophelia would wake before the sun rose, moving through the small cottage with the quiet efficiency of someone who had lived alone for a very long time, and Alira would join her at the wooden table near the hearth, where a simple breakfast of bread and dried fruit waited alongside a cup of bitter herbal tea that Ophelia insisted helped clear the mind for the lessons ahead. "Today," Ophelia said one such morning, setting down her tea and studying Alira with her clouded eyes, "we will try something different." Alira had grown used to the strange rhythm of her new life. In the weeks since her arrival, Ophelia had taught her about the history of the Ember Court, about the ancient bond between her bloodline and the invisible magic that shaped protective boundaries across the land. She had learned that her ancestors had once served as guardians for entire kingdoms, weaving wards so powerful that no enemy force could cross them without permission. She had learned, too, why such power had made her family a target, why fear and greed had driven other packs to hunt the Ember Court to near extinction generations ago. But knowledge alone had not yet translated into ability. Alira could sense the pull of old magic when she walked near boundary markers, a faint warmth in her chest, a subtle awareness she had felt her entire life without understanding what it meant. She had never been taught to shape that awareness into something she could control. "What kind of different?" Alira asked, setting down her own cup. "We will walk to the old stones at the edge of the clearing," Ophelia said, "and you will try to feel them, truly feel them, rather than simply sensing their presence from a distance." They walked together through the quiet morning forest, the air cool and damp with dew, until they reached a small ring of weathered stones half hidden beneath moss and fallen leaves. Alira had passed this spot several times during her walks around the cottage, but Ophelia had never brought her here directly until now. "These stones are old," Ophelia explained, gesturing toward the worn markings carved into their surfaces, symbols so faded they were barely visible to the naked eye. "Older than Blackmore. Older than most of the packs that exist today. They were placed here by your ancestors, long before this land had a name." Alira knelt beside the nearest stone, reaching out with hesitant fingers to trace the faded carvings. The moment her skin made contact with the cold stone surface, warmth flooded through her chest, spreading down her arm and into her fingertips, a sensation so sudden and powerful that she gasped and nearly pulled her hand away. "Don't resist it," Ophelia said quietly, her voice steady, despite the surprise clearly written on Alira's face. "Let it flow through you. Ask it to show you what it remembers." Alira closed her eyes, took a slow breath, and did as Ophelia instructed. At first, there was nothing but the strange warmth pulsing beneath her palm. Then, gradually, images began to form in her mind, faint and shifting, like memories that did not belong to her, but had somehow become accessible through the stone. She saw hands, weathered and old, placing this very stone into the earth. She saw a woman standing at the center of the clearing, arms raised, weaving threads of golden light between the stones, threads that stretched outward in every direction, forming a boundary that pulsed with quiet, protective strength. "I can see her," Alira whispered, her eyes still closed. "The woman who made this ward. I can see what she did." "That is your gift awakening," Ophelia said softly. "The Ember Court did not simply create wards through force of will alone. They understood the land, listened to it, worked with it, rather than against it. That understanding has been passed down through your blood, even though no one ever taught you to use it." Alira opened her eyes, blinking against the sudden brightness of the morning sun, filtering through the trees above them. Her hand still rested against the stone, and now she could feel, faintly, but unmistakably, a low hum of energy beneath her fingers, as though the stone itself were alive in some quiet, ancient way. "Can I do what she did?" Alira asked. "Can I create a ward like this?" "Not yet," Ophelia admitted. "What you felt just now was a memory, not an act of creation. True ward work requires years of practice, patience, and control. But what you experienced today tells me something important." "What's that?" "Your power is not dormant," Ophelia said. "It is simply waiting for you to reach for it, and the longer you practice, the stronger that reach will become." Over the following days, Alira's training grew more focused. Ophelia taught her to sense the subtle currents of old magic that ran beneath the forest floor, currents she had never noticed before despite having lived near similar magic her entire life within Blackmore's borders. She taught her breathing techniques to calm her mind before attempting to draw on her power, small rituals to ground herself when the energy felt overwhelming, and simple exercises meant to strengthen her connection to the land around her. Progress was slow, and there were many frustrating days when nothing seemed to work at all. When Alira sat beside the old stones for hours, without feeling so much as a flicker of warmth beneath her palms. But there were other days, quieter and more hopeful, when small successes reminded her that the path she had chosen was not a foolish one. One afternoon, nearly a month after her arrival at the cottage, Alira managed to coax a faint thread of golden light from her fingertips, watching in wonder as it drifted between two of the ancient stones before fading away entirely. It was a small thing, barely more than a spark, but Ophelia's reaction told her it was significant. "That," Ophelia said, her voice carrying genuine warmth for the first time since Alira had known her, "was your first true act of ward work. Small, yes. Fragile, yes. But real." Alira felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though she could not fully explain why. Perhaps it was relief. Perhaps it was pride, a feeling she had rarely allowed herself throughout her life in Blackmore, where she had always been taught, in ways subtle and unsubtle, that she was meant to remain quiet and unremarkable. Perhaps it was simply the joy of discovering, after so many years of feeling invisible, that she carried something extraordinary within her. "I want to learn more," Alira said, wiping her eyes and looking up at Ophelia with fierce determination. "I want to understand everything about what I am." "You will," Ophelia promised. "But understand this, Alira. The more you learn, the more dangerous your position becomes. There are those who would seek to use your power for their own purposes, rather than allowing you to decide how it should be used. You must be careful about who learns the truth of what you are. Elira nodded slowly, thinking of Blackmore, of the kingdom she had left behind. She wondered, sometimes late at night when sleep would not come easily, whether anyone there had noticed her absence yet, whether the wards she had unknowingly maintained for so many years were beginning to weaken now that she was gone. She wondered whether Kaidan Ashgrove ever thought of her at all, or whether she had already faded from his memory entirely, dismissed as easily as she had been rejected. She told herself it did not matter. She had a new life now, a new purpose, one that did not depend on anyone's approval or acceptance. She was learning to become someone entirely her own, shaped by her own choices, rather than by the expectations others had placed upon her. And yet, some nights, she found herself thinking about the look in Kaidan's eyes, as he had rejected her in front of the entire court, the casual cruelty of his words, and she wondered what he would think if he ever learned the truth of what he had thrown away. She did not yet know that, many miles away, his beta Korin had already begun uncovering the very secrets she had worked so hard to keep hidden. She did not yet know that the quiet, safe life she had built for herself in the forest was about to be disrupted by forces she had never anticipated. For now, she simply continued her training, day after day, growing stronger and more confident with each small success, unaware that the storm Ophelia had warned her about was drawing closer with every passing week. The attack came without warning, just past midnight, when the border patrol along the eastern woods was at its thinnest. A young guard named Elias Barrow was the first to sound the alarm, his horn blast cutting through the silent darkness as he stumbled back from the tree line, blood running from a shallow wound across his forearm. Behind him, shapes moved through the shadows between the trees, faster and stronger than any ordinary wolf, their eyes glowing with an unnatural intensity that made even seasoned warriors hesitate. By the time Kaidan arrived at the border with a full contingent of his strongest fighters, the attackers had already retreated back across the boundary line, vanishing into Nightfell territory as quickly as they had appeared. What remained was a scene of chaos. Torn fences, injured guards, and a section of the border where the ancient wards had clearly failed to hold, leaving nothing but empty, unprotected air, where an invisible barrier should have stood strong. How many wounded? Kaidan demanded, striding through the aftermath with his jaw tight and his eyes sweeping over the damage. 6, Korin reported, arriving at his side with a grim expression. None fatal, but 2 require serious healing. This was not a random incursion, Kaidan. This was deliberate. They knew exactly where the wards had weakened. Kaidan knelt beside the torn section of fence, running his fingers along the splintered wood, his mind racing through the implications of what he was seeing. Nightfell has been testing our borders for years, he said. But this is different. This was an actual attack, not simple provocation. They're probing our defenses, Korin said, testing to see how far the weakness extends. If the wards continue to fail, this will not be the last incursion. It will be the first of many. Kaidan stood and looked out across the dark tree line, toward the territory that belonged to his kingdom's oldest rival. He thought of Elira, of the secret bloodline Korin had uncovered, of the wards that had held strong for 20 years because of her unknowing presence within Blackmore's borders. The weight of his mistake settled over him with a heaviness he had never felt before. Have we made any progress finding her? He asked, his voice quieter now. Some, Korin said. A trader who passed through the southern road reported seeing a woman matching her description weeks ago, traveling alone toward the eastern forest. I've sent scouts to search the area, but the woods there are vast, and if she does not wish to be found, she will not be easy to locate. Then send more scouts, Kaidan said. Double the search efforts. I don't care what resources it requires. Korin studied his king carefully, noting the tension in his shoulders, the sharp edge in his voice, that had not been there weeks earlier, when he had dismissed the very idea that Elira's departure could matter to his kingdom's safety. This is not only about the wards anymore, is it? Korin said quietly. It was not really a question. Kaidan did not answer immediately. He looked back toward the damaged section of the border, toward the 6 wounded guards being carried away for treatment, toward the visible proof of the consequences his careless words had set into motion. It began about the wards, he finally said. I am no longer certain that is the only reason I want to find her. The following days brought little relief. Reports continued arriving from across the eastern border, each one describing similar patterns: brief incursions, quick retreats, small tests of Blackmore's weakened defenses. Nightfell's leadership had not yet launched a full assault, but every scout Kaidan sent to the border returned with the same grim assessment. The wards were continuing to fail, slowly but steadily, and it was only a matter of time before Nightfell grew bold enough to attempt something far more serious than probing attacks. Kaidan called an emergency council meeting, gathering his most trusted advisors around the long table in the war room. Maps covered the surface, marked with symbols indicating the weakened sections of the border, the locations of recent incursions, the movements of Nightfell forces along the shared boundary. "We cannot rely on the wards holding much longer," said an older advisor named Garrick, tapping a weathered finger against the map. "We need to reinforce our physical defenses, more guards along the border, additional watchtowers. We cannot depend on ancient magic that is clearly failing us." "Reinforcements take time we may not have," Corin countered, "and even doubled patrols cannot fully compensate for the protection the wards once provided. Nightfell knows this territory. If they launch a coordinated assault before we can strengthen our defenses, we may struggle to hold the line." Kaidan listened to the debate without speaking for several minutes, his mind turning over the same thoughts that had occupied him since the night of the attack. Finally, he raised a hand, silencing the room. "We will reinforce the physical defenses," he said. "Garrick, oversee that effort personally. But our true priority remains finding Alira Voss. If her presence truly maintained the wards, then finding her and convincing her to return may be the only way to fully restore our protection." "And if she refuses?" Garrick asked bluntly. "You rejected her in front of the entire court, Kaidan. Why would she agree to help a kingdom that humiliated her so publicly?" The question hung in the air, uncomfortable and pointed, but no one in the room disputed its fairness. Kaidan felt the weight of it settle over him, a reminder that his mistake was not simply a private regret, but a matter of public knowledge, one that would make any attempt to reach Alira all the more difficult. "I don't know if she will help us," Kaidan admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "But I intend to ask her myself, not through messengers or scouts, but face to face. I owe her that much, regardless of what she decides." The council meeting ended without full resolution, but the decision had been made. Reinforcements would strengthen the physical border defenses, while the search for Alira continued with renewed urgency. Kaidan spent the following days dividing his time between overseeing the defensive preparations and reviewing every scrap of information his scouts managed to gather about Alira's possible location. It was nearly a week later, when a scout named Tobias Gray returned from the eastern forest with news that finally offered a genuine lead. He had discovered a small, well-hidden cottage, deep within the woods, occupied by an elderly woman who matched descriptions of a seer named Ophelia Wren, exiled from Blackmore years earlier, for reasons that had never been fully documented. Villagers from a nearby settlement reported occasionally seeing a younger woman near the cottage, gathering herbs or drawing water from a nearby stream, though no one had gotten close enough to confirm her identity. Kaidan received this report with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had waited weeks for any solid lead, and now that one had finally arrived, he found himself uncertain about what to say to her when he finally stood face to face with the woman he had wronged so publicly. "I want to go myself," Kaidan told Corin that evening, as they reviewed Tobias's report together in the quiet privacy of the study. "Alone?" Corin asked, clearly skeptical of the idea. "Kaidan, if this truly is where Alira has been hiding, and if the seer who exiled herself from our kingdom is protecting her, you may not receive a warm welcome. It would be wiser to bring guards, or at the very least, allow me to accompany you. If I arrive with armed guards, I will only confirm every fear she likely has about returning to Blackmore," Kaidan said. "I need her to see that I am not there to force anything from her. I need her to understand that I intend to make this right, if she will allow me the chance." Corin studied his king for a long moment, weighing the risks against the potential benefits, before finally nodding in reluctant agreement. "Then go carefully," he said. "And Kaidan, whatever you find when you reach her, remember that she owes this kingdom nothing. If she refuses to help us, that refusal will be entirely justified." Kaidan nodded, understanding the truth in Corin's words even as a part of him hoped desperately that it would not come to that. He spent that night preparing for the journey, unable to sleep as he thought of what he might say when he finally saw Alira again, how he might begin to explain, let alone apologize for, the cruelty he had shown her in front of the entire court. He left before dawn the next morning, riding alone toward the eastern forest, carrying with him not only the fate of his kingdom's border defenses, but also the growing, unfamiliar weight of genuine remorse, a feeling he had rarely experienced in his life as Alpha King, and one he was only beginning to understand the true depth of. Behind him, Blackmore's guards continued their reinforced patrols along the weakened border, watching the tree line for any sign of Nightfell's return, while far away, in a small cottage hidden deep within the ancient forest, Alira Voss continued her training, entirely unaware that the king who had rejected her was now riding toward her with every intention of asking for something she might never be willing to give. Ophelia sensed the rider before Alira ever heard the sound of hooves on the forest path. She had been sitting near the hearth, sorting through a collection of dried herbs, when her clouded eyes suddenly lifted toward the cottage door, her expression sharpening with an alertness that made Alira pause mid-motion, a cup of tea halfway to her lips. "Someone is coming," Ophelia said. Alira set down her cup, her pulse quickening. In the weeks since her arrival, no one had come near the cottage, except the occasional villager passing along the forest path far in the distance. Ophelia had chosen this location precisely because of its isolation, and the sudden announcement of an approaching visitor sent a jolt of alarm through Alira's chest. "Who?" Alira asked, already moving toward the small window near the door. "I am not certain," Ophelia admitted, standing slowly and reaching for the worn walking stick she kept beside her chair. "But whoever it is carries a great deal of weight upon their shoulders. I can feel the heaviness of it even from here." Alira peered through the window, watching as a lone figure on horseback emerged from between the trees, moving steadily along the narrow path that led toward the cottage. Her breath caught in her throat the moment she recognized the rider, even from a distance, even after weeks of trying not to think of him at all. Kaidan Ashgrove. "It's him," Alira said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Alpha King." Ophelia's expression did not shift with surprise, which told Alira that some part of her teacher had already suspected this moment might arrive eventually. "Then it seems our quiet days are coming to an end," Ophelia said calmly. "The choice of how to greet him is entirely yours, Alira. You are not obligated to speak with him at all, if that is not what you wish." Alira's heart pounded as she watched Kaidan dismount at the edge of the clearing, his movements careful and deliberate, as though he understood he was approaching territory where he was not necessarily welcome. He wore no armor, carried no weapons that she could see, only a simple traveling cloak that made him look, for the first time since she had known him, almost ordinary. Part of her wanted to refuse to see him at all, to let Ophelia turn him away, and send him back to Blackmore with nothing but silence for an answer. She thought of the humiliation she had endured in the great hall, the disgust in his eyes, the casual cruelty of his rejection spoken in front of hundreds of witnesses. She owed him nothing, and every instinct told her that speaking with him now would only reopen wounds she had spent weeks learning to heal. But another part of her, quieter and more curious, wondered what could have driven the Alpha King of Blackmore to travel alone through unfamiliar territory, seeking out a woman he had so thoroughly dismissed. She thought of the wards, of Ophelia's warnings about the growing danger along Blackmore's borders, and she suspected, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that she already knew part of the answer. "I'll speak with him," Alira finally said, straightening her shoulders and reaching for the door. "Are you certain?" Ophelia asked. "No," Alira admitted, "but I would rather hear what he has to say than spend the rest of my life wondering why he came." She stepped outside, into the cool afternoon air, and Kaidan's head turned toward her, the moment the cottage door opened. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. He looked different than she remembered, tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the journey he had just completed, his golden eyes carrying none of the arrogance and disgust she had seen the night of the choosing ceremony. "Alira," he said finally, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Alpha King," she replied, deliberately formal, keeping distance in her tone, even as her heart raced beneath her calm exterior. Kaidan flinched slightly at the title, as though it stung him more than he had expected. "I did not come here to demand anything from you," he said. "I came to ask for a conversation. If you are willing to grant me that much, I will be grateful." If not, I will leave, and I will not trouble you again." Alira studied him carefully, searching his face for any sign of the mockery or condescension she remembered from the Great Hall. She found none. Instead, she found something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine regret. "You may speak," she said finally. "I make no promises beyond that." They walked together to a fallen log near the edge of the clearing, sitting a careful distance apart, while Ophelia remained near the cottage door, watching quietly but making no move to intervene. Kaidan took a long breath before he began, as though gathering the courage to say words he had rehearsed many times during his journey, but still found difficult to speak aloud. "I was wrong," he said simply, "about everything I said to you that night. I judged you based on nothing more than appearances, and I humiliated you in front of people who had no right to witness such cruelty. I have thought of little else since that night, and I am ashamed of the man I was in that moment." Illyra remained silent, letting him continue, though something in her chest loosened slightly at his words, a tension she had carried since the night of the ceremony, without fully realizing how heavy it had become. "Since your departure," Kaidan continued, "Blackmore has faced growing threats along our eastern border. The protective wards that have held strong for 20 years are weakening, and my beta discovered evidence suggesting your presence within our kingdom's borders was somehow connected to their strength. Nightfell has already launched incursions, testing our weakened defenses. Guards have been injured. I fear it is only a matter of time before a full assault follows." Illyra felt a complicated mixture of emotions rise within her. Vindication, that her suspicions about her connection to the wards had been correct, but also a flare of anger that made her pulse quicken. "So this is why you came," she said, her voice sharper now. "Not because you regret how you treated me, but because you need what I can offer your kingdom." "That is not why I came," Kaidan said quickly, meeting her eyes directly. "I will not deny that Blackmore needs your help, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I am not asking you to return out of guilt over the wards alone. I am asking because I owe you an apology, regardless of what happens to my kingdom, and because I have come to understand, far too late, that I dismissed someone far more remarkable than I ever allowed myself to see." Illyra looked away, staring out at the quiet forest surrounding them, her thoughts a tangled mess of conflicting feelings. She thought of the weeks she had spent training with Ophelia, discovering a version of herself she had never known existed, a woman with power and purpose that had nothing to do with Blackmore, or the king who had rejected her. She thought too of Mira, of Greta, of the innocent people within the kingdom who had nothing to do with Kaidan's cruelty, but who would suffer if Nightfell launched a true assault against a weakened border. "I am not the same woman who left Blackmore weeks ago," Illyra said finally. "I have learned things about myself, about my history, that have changed how I see my own worth. I will not return simply because you now realize you need me. I would never ask you to return as anything less than exactly who you are," Kaidan said. "Not as a healing house assistant, not as a mate you can dismiss when it suits you. If you choose to return, it will be on your own terms, with whatever position and respect you believe you deserve. I have no right to ask for anything more than that." Illyra turned to study him again, searching for any trace of deception in his expression, but found only quiet sincerity, a humility she would never have believed possible from the man who had stood on that platform weeks ago, casually destroying her dignity in front of an entire kingdom. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is not a decision I will make in a single conversation." "That is more than fair," Kaidan said, relief evident in his voice despite her lack of a definite answer. "Take whatever time you need. I will not pressure you further." He rose from the fallen log, preparing to return to his horse and begin the journey back toward Blackmore, but paused before leaving, turning back to look at her one final time. "For whatever it is worth," he said quietly, "I am glad you are safe. Whatever you decide, I am glad you found this place, and I am glad you are well." Illyra watched him mount his horse and ride away, disappearing back into the trees the same way he had arrived, and she remained seated on the fallen log for a long while after he had gone, turning his words over in her mind, uncertain what she truly believed, uncertain what path she wanted her future to take. Ophelia approached quietly and settled beside her, saying nothing for several long moments, simply offering silent companionship while Illyra processed the conversation she had just experienced. "What will you do?" Ophelia finally asked. I don't know, Alira admitted. Part of me wants to refuse, simply because I can. Because for the first time in my life, I have the power to say no to something and have it matter. But another part of me thinks of the people in Blackmore who never wronged me, who would suffer if I let my anger guide every decision I make. Wisdom often lives in that uncertainty, Ophelia said. The answer will come when you are ready to find it. Until then, continue your training. Whatever you decide, you will need your strength. Alira nodded slowly, watching the empty forest path where Kaidan had disappeared, and she found herself, despite every reason she had to resist it, wondering whether the man who had rejected her so cruelly weeks ago might truly be capable of becoming someone worthy of her trust. News of a stranger's visit to Ophelia Wren's cottage did not stay quiet for long. Word traveled through the small settlements scattered near the eastern forest, passed from villager to villager, until it reached ears that Alira had never intended to reach at all. Within days, a man named Callan Thorn, the alpha of a neighboring pack known as Thornwild, learned of a young woman living under the seer's protection, a woman whose presence had apparently drawn the Alpha King of Blackmore himself out on a personal journey through unfamiliar territory. Callan Thorn was not a man who ignored such details. His pack, though smaller than Blackmore, had ambitions that stretched far beyond their current borders, and he had long resented the dominance Blackmore held over the northern territories. When his scouts confirmed that the woman in question carried a bloodline connected to ancient boundary magic, magic capable of shaping the very wards that determined whose territory held strong and whose crumbled, Callan understood immediately the value of what he had discovered. He arrived at the cottage nearly 2 weeks after Kaidan's visit, though his approach was far less humble than the Alpha King's had been. He came with 6 guards at his side, their presence a clear demonstration of authority rather than any gesture of respect, and he did not wait to be invited before striding toward the cottage door. Alira had been outside gathering herbs near the edge of the clearing when she noticed the approaching group, and she felt an immediate wariness settle over her, distinctly different from the uncertain hope she had felt upon Kaidan's earlier visit. There was nothing hesitant or apologetic in Callan Thorn's posture. He walked like a man who expected to receive whatever he had come for. Alira Voss, Callan said, stopping a short distance from her, his eyes assessing her with open calculation. I have heard remarkable things about you. I don't believe we've met, Alira said carefully, straightening from her work and keeping several paces of distance between them. Callan Thorn, he said, offering a slight bow that felt more performative than sincere. Alpha of Thornwild, I have come a long way to speak with someone of your unique bloodline. Ophelia appeared at the cottage door then, her expression hardening the moment she recognized the visitor and understood the nature of his arrival. Thornwild guards are not welcome on this land, she said sharply, her walking stick striking the ground with unmistakable authority despite her small stature. I mean no disrespect, Callan said smoothly, though his tone carried little genuine apology. I simply wish to speak with Miss Voss about an opportunity that could benefit us both. I am not interested in opportunities offered by strangers who arrive with armed guards, Alira said, her voice steady, despite the unease growing in her chest. Callan's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of calculation passing behind his eyes as he adjusted his approach. Forgive the guards, he said. The roads through this forest are not always safe, and I would not risk traveling without protection, but I assure you, my intentions here are purely to offer you something Blackmore never could. And what would that be? Alira asked, unable to fully suppress her curiosity despite her wariness. Respect, Callan said simply. I understand that Blackmore's king rejected you publicly, humiliated you in front of his entire court, and only sought you out again once he realized your absence threatened his kingdom's safety. I would never treat someone of your bloodline with such disregard. In Thornwild, you would be valued from the very beginning, given a position of honor rather than dismissed as unworthy. Alira felt a flash of anger at his words, not because they were untrue, but because she recognized immediately the manipulation woven through them. Callan Thorn did not care about her worth as a person, any more than Kaidan had, weeks ago, before he learned the truth of her bloodline. He simply saw a valuable tool, one he hoped to claim for his own pack's benefit, before Blackmore could reclaim her first. You know nothing of what happened between myself and the Alpha King, Alira said coldly, and you know nothing of what I want for my own future. Then tell me, Callan said, spreading his hands in a gesture of false openness. "What do you want, Alira Voss? Because I suspect Blackmoor's king has already come here seeking your help, asking you to save the very kingdom that humiliated you, expecting you to sacrifice your own interests for people who never valued you as anything more than a convenient healer." His words struck closer to the truth than Alira wanted to admit, and she found herself unable to immediately counter them, which only seemed to encourage him further. "Join Thornwild instead," Callan continued, his voice smooth and persuasive. "Help us strengthen our own borders, and in return, you will receive a place of true honor within our pack, resources beyond anything Blackmoor ever offered you, and the satisfaction of watching the kingdom that rejected you struggle without the protection you once unknowingly provided." Alira studied him carefully, recognizing the appeal of his offer even as every instinct warned her against trusting it. There was something undeniably tempting about the idea of walking away entirely, of allowing Blackmoor to face the consequences of Kaidan's cruelty without her intervention, of finding a new home where her bloodline would be celebrated rather than merely tolerated once its usefulness became apparent. But beneath that temptation, she recognized something else in Callan Thorne's eyes, a hunger that unsettled her far more than Kaidan's initial disgust ever had. Kaidan, for all his early cruelty, had at least come to her alone, without armed guards, offering nothing but an honest apology and a genuine request. Callan had arrived with a show of force and words, designed purely to manipulate her into serving his ambitions, wrapped in false promises of respect that felt, the longer she considered them, entirely hollow. "I have not yet decided what I will do," Alira said finally, choosing her words carefully. "But I will not be deciding today, and I will not be deciding under the shadow of armed guards standing at the edge of this clearing." Callan's expression tightened slightly, his patience clearly wearing thin, though he maintained his composed exterior. "I understand your caution," he said. "But do not take too long to decide, Alira. Blackmoor's weakness will not last forever, and other packs beyond Thornwild may soon recognize the same opportunity I have recognized today. It would be wise to align yourself with allies who value you, before circumstances force a decision upon you." With that thinly veiled threat lingering in the air, Callan Thorne turned and departed with his guards, disappearing back into the forest the way he had come. Alira remained standing near the edge of the clearing long after he had gone, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and unease. "He will return," Ophelia said quietly, coming to stand beside her once the guards had fully vanished from sight. "Men like Callan Thorne do not give up easily once they have identified something they desire." "I know," Alira said, wrapping her arms around herself against a chill that had nothing to do with the forest air. "And I fear that whatever decision I make, someone will suffer the consequences of it." "That is often the burden of power," Ophelia said gently. "But remember, Alira, you are not obligated to choose between Blackmoor and Thornwild alone. There may be a path that serves your own interests without surrendering yourself entirely to either side." Alira turned to look at her teacher, considering the wisdom in her words even as uncertainty continued to churn within her chest. She thought of Kaidan's humble apology, of Callan's calculated manipulation, and she wondered which path, if either, truly offered her the future she wanted for herself. That night, as she lay awake in the small cottage, listening to the quiet sounds of the forest outside her window, Alira made a decision that surprised even herself. She would continue her training, strengthen her abilities as much as possible, and prepare herself not to serve either Blackmoor or Thornwild blindly, but to make her own choice from a position of genuine strength, rather than desperation or manipulation from either side. She did not yet know how soon that choice would be forced upon her, or how dramatically the growing rivalry between Blackmoor and Thornwild would soon collide, dragging her directly into the center of a conflict that threatened to reshape the future of the entire Northern Territory. Kaidan learned of Callan Thorne's visit to the cottage only 3 days after it happened, and the news struck him with an urgency that surprised even himself. A trader passing through the eastern settlements had mentioned, almost in passing, that Thornwild guards had been seen traveling toward the forest where a seer lived in exile, and Corin, who had maintained careful watch over any information related to Alira's whereabouts, brought the report to Kaidan immediately. "Thornwild," Kaidan repeated, his jaw tightening as he processed the implications. "Callan Thorne has always resented Blackmoor's dominance in the north. If he learns the truth about Alira's bloodline, He will not hesitate to use it against us. There is more, Corin said grimly. My sources suggest he did not simply learn of her existence. He traveled to the cottage himself, with armed guards, and spoke with her directly. Kaidan felt a surge of something he did not immediately recognize, a sharp, protective anger that went far beyond simple concern over his kingdom's border defenses. The thought of Callan Thorne standing before Alira, likely offering false promises wrapped in manipulation, filled him with an urgency he had not felt even during the initial border attacks. I need to speak with her again, Kaidan said. Before Thornwild convinces her that we are no different from them, that her only value lies in the power she carries, rather than who she truly is. Kaidan, Corin said carefully, you cannot force her decision. If she chooses Thornwild, or chooses neither side entirely, that is her right. Pressuring her further may only push her away. I am not going to pressure her, Kaidan said. I am going to ensure she understands the difference between an offer built on genuine respect and one built on manipulation. Whatever she decides afterward will be entirely her own choice. Corin studied his king for a long moment, noting the intensity in his expression, an intensity that seemed to extend well beyond simple political concern. You care for her, Corin observed quietly. Beyond what she can offer this kingdom. Kaidan did not immediately deny it, which told Corin everything he needed to know. I do not know what I feel, Kaidan admitted honestly. I know that I was wrong about her from the very beginning. I know that every conversation we have had since her departure has only deepened my regret over how I treated her. Whether that regret has grown into something more, I cannot yet say with certainty. Then perhaps it is time to find out, Corin said, before Callan Thorne makes that decision for you. Kaidan departed for the cottage the following morning, once again riding alone, though this time he carried with him a growing awareness of just how much was at stake, not only for his kingdom's border defenses, but for something far more personal that had begun to take root within him during the weeks since Alira's departure. When he arrived at the clearing, he found Alira waiting near the fallen log where they had spoken during his previous visit, as though some part of her had expected his return. Ophelia stood at a distance near the cottage, watching carefully but not intervening. You've heard about Callan Thorne's visit, Alira said, before Kaidan could speak, correctly reading the tension in his expression. I have, Kaidan admitted, settling onto the log a careful distance from her. I came to make certain you understood the difference between his offer and mine, though I suspect you have already recognized it yourself. I am not a fool, Kaidan, Alira said, using his name directly for the first time since his initial visit, a small shift that did not go unnoticed by either of them. I understood exactly what Callan Thorne wanted the moment he arrived, with armed guards and empty promises of respect. I am simply uncertain whether your offer is truly different, or whether it is merely dressed in gentler words. The directness of her question caught Kaidan off guard, and he took a long moment before answering, wanting to choose his words carefully, rather than offering easy reassurances that might ring hollow. I cannot prove the difference through words alone, he said finally. I can only tell you that I have thought of little else since the night I rejected you, and that my regret has never been purely about the wards or Blackmore's safety. I think of the courage you showed in that hall, walking away with your dignity intact, despite the cruelty I showed you. I think of the strength it must have taken to build an entirely new life for yourself in these woods. I admire you, Alira, for reasons that have nothing to do with what your bloodline can offer my kingdom. Alira was quiet for a long moment, studying his face carefully, searching once again for any trace of deception or performance in his words. She found, as she had during his previous visit, only sincerity, though this time it was accompanied by something else, a vulnerability she had not expected from a man who once stood so confidently before his entire court, rejecting her without a moment's hesitation. I have spent these past weeks learning to control abilities I never knew I possessed, Alira said finally. I have learned about my family, about the history of the Ember Court, about the price my ancestors paid for the very power I now carry. I am not the same woman you rejected in that hall, Kaidan. If I choose to return to Blackmore, it will not be as your quiet, overlooked mate. It will be as someone who commands genuine respect, someone whose worth is recognized regardless of the power she carries. I would expect nothing less, Kaidan said firmly, and I would welcome nothing less. Whatever position you choose to hold within Blackmore, whatever respect you demand, I will ensure it is given freely and completely. Alira felt something shift within her chest at his words, a cautious warmth she had not expected to feel toward the man who had once humiliated her so publicly. She was not yet ready to fully trust it, not yet ready to abandon the wariness she had built up over the past weeks, but she recognized, with growing clarity, that Kaidan Ashgrove was not the same man who had stood on that platform in the Great Hall, and perhaps, she was not the same woman who had walked away from it either. I need more time, she said finally. But know this, Kaidan. Whatever I ultimately decide, it will not be because Callan Thorne pressured me into choosing sides, and it will not be because I fear the consequences of refusing either of you. It will be because I have found the path that truly serves who I have become. That is all I could ever ask, Kaidan said, rising from the log as he prepared to depart once again. Take whatever time you need, Alira. I will not return again until you send word that you are ready, unless circumstances beyond my control force my hand. As he turned to leave, Alira found herself speaking again, almost before she had fully decided to say the words aloud. Kaidan, she called out, and he turned back to face her, waiting. Thank you for not pressuring me the way Callan Thorne did. It means more than you may realize. Kaidan offered her a small, genuine smile, the first she had seen from him since long before the night of the choosing ceremony. You deserve nothing less than genuine respect, he said. I intend to spend as long as it takes proving that to you. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Alira once again standing at the edge of the clearing, her thoughts a complicated tangle of cautious hope and lingering uncertainty. Behind her, Ophelia approached quietly, her expression thoughtful. You are beginning to trust him, Ophelia observed. I don't know if trust is the right word yet, Alira admitted, but I am beginning to believe that he has truly changed, and that belief frightens me more than I expected it to. Why does it frighten you? Ophelia asked. Because if I allow myself to trust him, Alira said quietly, and I am wrong, the pain of that mistake will be far greater than anything I felt the night he rejected me in front of his entire court. Ophelia placed a gentle hand on Alira's shoulder, offering silent comfort rather than easy answers. Growth always carries risk, she said simply. But so does refusing to grow at all. Whatever you decide, Alira, decide it because it is what you truly want, not because fear of being hurt again has made the decision for you. Alira nodded slowly, watching the empty forest path where Kaidan had disappeared once more, and she found herself, for the first time since her arrival in the forest, beginning to imagine a future that included returning to Blackmoor, not as the woman who had been rejected, but as someone who had reclaimed her own power and worth, entirely on her own terms. She did not yet know that events beyond her control were already accelerating toward a confrontation that would force her hand far sooner than she expected, a confrontation that would test not only her growing abilities, but her willingness to fight for the future she had only just begun to imagine for herself. Callan Thorne did not react well to rejection, and when word reached him that Alira had not immediately accepted his offer, his patience began to wear thin far faster than anyone at Thornwild had anticipated. He gathered his closest advisors within the great hall of his own fortress, a structure far less grand than Blackmoor's castle, but no less imposing in its own right, built from dark stone that seemed to absorb the light of every torch lining its walls. His second-in-command, a sharp-tongued woman named Vesna Cole, stood at his side as he paced before the assembled council, his frustration evident in every sharp movement. She is stalling, Callan said, his voice tight with irritation, weighing offers as though she has the luxury of endless time to decide. Perhaps she simply requires patience, Vesna suggested carefully. Bloodlines as rare as hers do not make hasty decisions. Patience is a luxury we cannot afford, Callan snapped. Blackmoor's king has already visited her twice. If he convinces her to return before we secure her loyalty, every advantage we might have gained will be lost entirely. What do you propose? Vesna asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer and did not fully approve of it. We will not wait for her to decide, Callan said, his eyes narrowing with calculation. We will take a more direct approach. If she will not join us willingly, we will ensure that Blackmoor no longer remains an appealing option for her, weakening their position so thoroughly that Thornwild becomes her only reasonable path forward. Vesna's expression tightened with concern. You intend to attack Blackmoor's border directly. Their defenses are already weakened, Callan said. If we strike now, before their reinforcements are fully established, we could claim significant territory along the eastern boundary, further destabilizing their kingdom and demonstrating clearly that Blackmoor cannot protect what it claims to value. Once Alira sees how thoroughly her former kingdom has crumbled, joining Thornwild will become the only sensible choice remaining to her. And if this strategy fails? Vesna asked. If it only strengthens her resolve against us, or draws her closer to Kaidan Ashgrove, rather than pushing her away? Callan waved off her concerns with visible impatience. It will not fail. Blackmoor is vulnerable, and vulnerability must be exploited before circumstances change. Prepare our forces. We move within the week. Word of Thornwild's growing military preparations reached Blackmoor through a network of informants Corin had carefully cultivated over the years, arriving at the castle just 3 days after Callan's fateful council meeting. Kaidan received the report with a grim sense of inevitability, as though he had known, somewhere deep within his instincts, that the tension building between the two kingdoms would eventually erupt into open conflict. Thornwild is mobilizing, Corin reported, spreading intelligence documents across the war room table. Their forces are gathering near the shared border with unusual urgency. This is not a simple show of strength, Kaidan. This appears to be preparation for a genuine assault. They intend to exploit our weakened wards, Kaidan said, studying the maps with sharp focus. Callan Thorn grows impatient with Alira's hesitation, and he seeks to force her hand by demonstrating Blackmoor's vulnerability. We must prepare accordingly, Garrick added, his weathered face set with grim determination. Our reinforced patrols have helped, but they cannot fully compensate for the failing wards. If Thornwild launches a coordinated assault along multiple points of the border simultaneously, we may struggle to hold every position. Kaidan felt the weight of the coming conflict settle over him, a heaviness that extended far beyond simple military strategy. He thought of Alira, alone in the forest with only Ophelia for protection, caught directly in the middle of a rivalry that threatened to consume her regardless of which side she ultimately chose. He thought of the innocent people within his own kingdom, the guards who had already been injured, the villagers along the eastern settlements who would suffer most directly if Thornwild's forces broke through the weakened border. We need to warn her, Kaidan said suddenly. If Thornwild is preparing an assault to pressure her decision, she deserves to know the danger she may soon face, regardless of what she ultimately chooses to do. I will send a rider immediately, Corin said, already moving toward the door. No, Kaidan said, stopping him. I will go myself. If this conflict is truly being driven by Callan Thorn's desire to force her hand, then she needs to hear this directly from me, not through a messenger who cannot fully convey the urgency of what we now face. Kaidan, you cannot leave the castle now, Garrick protested. If Thornwild launches their assault while you are away, our forces will need your leadership here, not miles away in the forest. I will return before any assault begins, Kaidan said firmly. Corin, prepare our defenses in my absence. Reinforce every weakened section of the border you can identify. I will return within 2 days, regardless of what Alira decides. Despite continued protests from his advisors, Kaidan departed for the cottage once again that same evening, riding through the darkness with an urgency that pushed his horse harder than either of his previous journeys. He arrived at the clearing well past midnight, and Ophelia met him at the cottage door before he had even fully dismounted, her clouded eyes reflecting the moonlight with unsettling clarity. You bring troubling news, Ophelia said, not as a question. I need to speak with Alira immediately, Kaidan said. Thornwild is preparing to attack Blackmoor's border, and I believe Callan Thorn intends this assault to pressure her into joining his kingdom rather than mine. Ophelia's expression darkened, and she stepped aside to allow him entry, calling for Alira as she did so. Alira emerged from the small back room moments later, wrapped in a simple sleeping robe, her eyes still heavy with interrupted sleep, but sharpening quickly as she registered the urgency in Kaidan's expression. What has happened? She asked. Kaidan explained everything Corin's informants had reported, watching as Alira's expression shifted from confusion to growing alarm as she understood the full implications of what Callan Thorn intended. He means to use violence to force my decision, Alira said, anger flaring in her voice. He means to destroy innocent lives, simply to prove a point. I fear that is exactly his intention, Kaidan confirmed. I do not come here tonight to pressure you into any particular choice, Alira. But I believe you deserve to understand fully what is happening, and what consequences may follow regardless of what you ultimately decide. Alira sat heavily in the chair nearest the hearth, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just learned. She thought of the guards who had already been injured during Nightfell's earlier incursions, of the villagers along Blackmoor's eastern settlements who had done nothing to deserve becoming pawns in Callan Thorne's political maneuvering. She thought, too, of her own growing abilities, still fragile and undeveloped, uncertain whether she possessed enough control to make any meaningful difference in a genuine military conflict. I am not ready, she said quietly, more to herself than to either Kaidan or Ophelia. My training is far from complete. I cannot simply walk into a battle and expect my abilities to hold back an entire assault. No one is asking that of you, Kaidan said gently. I did not come here tonight seeking a warrior. I came because I believed you deserved honesty, regardless of the outcome. Alira looked up at him, studying his face carefully in the dim light of the hearth fire, searching once again for any trace of manipulation in his words. She found none, only quiet concern and genuine respect for her right to make her own choices, even in the face of grave danger. I need to think, she said finally. But Kaidan, if Thornwild truly intends to attack innocent people, simply to force my hand, I cannot simply stand by and allow that to happen, regardless of what I ultimately decide about my own future. Kaidan nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what she was beginning to consider, even as neither of them yet knew exactly what form her eventual choice would take. Whatever you decide, he said, know that I will respect it completely. But please, Alira, be careful. Callan Thorne is not a man who accepts refusal gracefully, and I fear this conflict may grow more dangerous before it grows any safer. He departed shortly after, riding back toward Blackmoor through the remaining hours of darkness, leaving Alira alone with Ophelia, and the weight of an impossible decision pressing heavily upon her shoulders. She spent the remainder of that night sitting before the hearth fire, turning over every possibility in her mind, uncertain which path would truly protect the innocent people caught in the middle of a conflict that had never been theirs to begin with. By the time dawn broke over the forest, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink, Alira had made her decision. It was not the decision either Kaidan or Callan Thorne had hoped for, but it was, she believed, the only choice that truly aligned with the woman she had become during her weeks of training and self-discovery. She would find a way to protect everyone, regardless of which kingdom they called home. The assault began at dawn, 3 days after Kaidan's midnight visit to the cottage, when Thornwild forces crossed the weakened eastern border, in numbers far greater than any previous incursion. Guards stationed along the boundary sounded the alarm the moment the first wave of attackers emerged from the tree line, but the sheer scale of the assault overwhelmed the reinforced patrols almost immediately. Callan Thorne had committed the majority of his kingdom's fighting force to this single, decisive strike, understanding that a swift and overwhelming display of strength would accomplish far more than a series of smaller, hesitant attacks. Kaidan received the news within minutes of the alarm being raised, and he moved through the castle with sharp, decisive urgency, calling every available fighter to the eastern border, while Corin coordinated the defense of the settlements closest to the boundary. How many are they sending? Kaidan demanded as he strapped on his armor, Corin relaying updates from scouts as quickly as the information arrived. Reports suggest nearly their entire fighting force, Corin said grimly. This is not a probing attack, Kaidan. Callan Thorne intends to claim significant territory, perhaps even push toward the settlements themselves, if our defenses fail to hold. Then we hold them at the border, Kaidan said, fastening the final piece of his armor with grim determination. Whatever it costs us, we do not allow them to reach the innocent people living beyond that line. The battle that followed was fierce and chaotic, fought across the churned earth of the border territory, as Blackmoor's forces struggled to hold their ground against Thornwild's overwhelming numbers. Kaidan fought at the front lines, alongside his most trusted warriors. His focus narrowed entirely to the immediate task of protecting every inch of ground his forces still held, even as reports continued arriving of sections where the weakened wards had allowed Thornwild fighters to slip through with alarming ease. It was nearly midday, with Blackmoor's forces beginning to show clear signs of exhaustion against the relentless assault, when a sudden shift occurred that no one on either side had anticipated. A wave of golden light erupted from the tree line behind Blackmoor's position, spreading outward across the battlefield, like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. Fighters on both sides paused, momentarily stunned by the sudden brilliance, as the light coalesced into a shimmering barrier that stretched along the entire length of the border, pushing back against the areas where Thornwild forces had already begun to advance. Illyra emerged from the tree line moments later, her hands raised, her expression fierce with concentration, as she poured every ounce of her training into the effort of reinforcing the failing wards in real time. Ophelia walked at her side, offering quiet guidance, though the true strength driving the barrier came entirely from Illyra herself. Kaidan spotted her immediately, and relief and alarm warred within him in equal measure, as he watched her stand exposed, at the edge of the battlefield, channeling power far beyond anything she had ever attempted during her weeks of careful, controlled practice. "Fall back to the reinforced position," Kaidan shouted to his nearest fighters, moving quickly to place himself between Illyra and the advancing line of Thornwild soldiers who had begun to notice the source of the sudden barrier. Callan Thorn, watching from a rise overlooking the battlefield, felt a surge of frustrated fury as he realized what was happening. "She has chosen to strengthen Blackmoor's defenses," he snarled to Vesna, who stood beside him surveying the shifting tide of the battle. "After everything, she sides with them." "She sides with no one," Vesna observed carefully, watching as the golden light continued spreading, pushing back not only against the sections where Thornwild had broken through, but seeming to stabilize the entire boundary line equally. "Look closely, Callan. She is not simply reinforcing Blackmoor's position. She is restoring balance to the entire border, denying either side an unfair advantage." Callan's jaw tightened as he recognized the truth in Vesna's observation. Illyra was not fighting for Blackmoor. She was fighting to end the conflict itself, refusing to allow either kingdom to claim victory through violence and manipulation. "Then we take her by force," Callan said, already turning to signal a group of his most elite fighters. "If she will not choose Thornwild willingly, we will ensure she has no choice remaining." Kaidan noticed the shift in Thornwild's formation just moments before Callan's elite fighters began pushing directly toward Illyra's position, and he understood immediately what they intended. "Protect her," he shouted to his nearest warriors, already moving to intercept the advancing group himself. What followed was a desperate, close struggle at the very edge of the battlefield, Blackmoor's fighters working to hold back Thornwild's elite forces, while Illyra continued pouring her strength into the barrier, sweat beading on her forehead, her arms trembling with the strain of maintaining power, far beyond what her training had prepared her for. Kaidan fought his way through the chaos, cutting down every fighter who attempted to breach the protective circle his warriors had formed around Illyra's position. His focus narrowed entirely to the singular goal of keeping her safe, long enough to complete whatever she was attempting to accomplish. When Callan Thorn himself finally broke through the outer defenses, moving directly toward Illyra with clear intent to seize her by force, Kaidan intercepted him personally, blocking his path with unwavering determination. "This ends now, Callan," Kaidan said, his voice carrying clearly, despite the chaos of battle surrounding them. "You will not take her against her will. She belongs to whoever recognizes her true worth," Callan spat, drawing his weapon with fierce resolve. "You had your chance and threw it away. I will not make the same mistake." The confrontation between the two alphas was brief but intense, each man fighting with everything his kingdom's honor demanded, until Kaidan finally gained the advantage, disarming Callan and forcing him to the ground with a decisive final strike that left no doubt about the outcome. "Yield," Kaidan demanded, his weapon steady despite his exhaustion. "This conflict ends here, or it ends with your death. The choice is yours." Callan, staring up at his defeat with bitter recognition, finally raised a hand in surrender, calling out to his remaining forces to withdraw from the battlefield entirely. As Thornwild's fighters began their retreat, the golden barrier Illyra had been maintaining finally stabilized fully, settling into a steady, unwavering glow that marked the border more clearly and strongly than it had appeared in years. Illyra lowered her hands slowly, her body swaying with exhaustion as the final surge of power left her system, and Kaidan reached her side just in time to catch her, as her legs finally gave way beneath the strain of what she had accomplished. "I have you," he said quietly, lowering her gently to the ground and cradling her against his chest as her eyes fluttered, consciousness slipping away from the sheer effort she had expended. "You saved them, Illyra. You saved everyone." As the battlefield finally fell silent around them, the retreating sounds of Thornwild's forces fading into the distance, Kaiden held Alira carefully in his arms, watching over her with a fierce protectiveness that left no doubt, to anyone who witnessed the moment, about the depth of what he had come to feel for the woman he had once so carelessly rejected. The battle was over, but the true reckoning, both for Kaidan's kingdom and for the fragile, complicated bond between himself and Alira, had only just begun. Alira woke slowly, warmth surrounding her, sunlight filtering gently through unfamiliar curtains, and for a brief, disoriented moment, she could not remember where she was. Then the memories returned in a rush. The battle, the golden barrier stretching across the border, the desperate effort of holding back a conflict that had threatened to consume everyone caught within it. She sat up quickly, only to find gentle hands steadying her, and she turned to see Kaidan seated beside the bed, relief flooding across his features the moment her eyes opened fully. "You're awake," he said softly. "You have been resting for 2 full days. I feared you might not wake at all." "Where am I?" Alira asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Blackmore," Kaidan said. "My personal chambers, though I have been sleeping elsewhere while you recovered. I did not want you waking in an unfamiliar place after everything you sacrificed for us." Alira absorbed this information slowly, her mind still foggy from exhaustion, but gradually, the full weight of what had happened settled over her. "The battle," she said. "Did the barrier hold? Are the people along the border safe?" "They are safe," Kaidan confirmed. "The wards have not only stabilized, they appear stronger than they have been in years. Whatever you accomplished on that battlefield, it did far more than simply hold back Thornwild's assault. It restored something that had been slowly failing for far longer than any of us realized." Relief washed through Alira, easing some of the tension that had gripped her chest since she first woke. "And Callan Thorn?" "Defeated and forced to retreat," Kaidan said. "He will not soon forget the cost of underestimating you, or the consequences of attempting to seize what does not belong to him." Alira nodded slowly, processing everything, and then she looked at Kaidan directly, studying his exhausted but sincere expression. "You fought for me," she said quietly. "On that battlefield, you protected me from Callan's forces." "I would do far more than that," Kaidan said, his voice carrying quiet intensity. "Alira, I have spent these past weeks coming to understand something I should have recognized the very night I met you. I was blind, arrogant, and cruel, and I judged you based on nothing more than surface appearances that meant nothing about your true worth. You have shown more courage, more strength, and more genuine goodness than I have witnessed in anyone throughout my entire life as Alpha King." Alira felt her chest tighten with emotion, uncertain how to respond to the raw sincerity in his words. "I am not the same woman you rejected," she said finally. "I will not accept anything less than genuine partnership, genuine respect, should I ever choose to stand beside you again." "I would never ask for anything less," Kaidan said, moving to kneel beside the bed so their eyes met more directly. "Alira, I know I have no right to ask this, after everything I put you through, but I am asking regardless, because I believe you deserve honesty above all else. I love you, not for the power you carry, not for what your bloodline can offer this kingdom, but for the woman you have shown yourself to be, time and again, even when I gave you every reason to walk away and never look back." Silence stretched between them for a long moment, Alira searching his face for any final trace of doubt, but finding only complete sincerity. She thought of the journey that had brought her to this moment, the humiliation in the great hall, the quiet strength she had discovered in the forest, the courage it had taken to stand on that battlefield and choose protection over vengeance, unity over division. "I forgive you," she said finally, and the words carried a weight that seemed to settle something deep within both of them. "Not because you have earned back everything you took from me that night, but because I believe you have truly changed, and because I choose to build something new, rather than remain trapped by what happened before." Kaidan's eyes shone with barely restrained emotion at her words, and he reached out carefully to take her hand, waiting for her permission, before closing his fingers gently around hers. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I promise you, Alira, I will spend the rest of my life proving that your forgiveness was not misplaced." In the weeks that followed, Blackmore slowly healed from the conflict that had nearly torn it apart. Alira's recovery continued steadily, and as her strength returned, She began the work of formally establishing her place within the kingdom, not as a quiet, overlooked mate, but as a woman recognized throughout the pack for the extraordinary sacrifice she had made on the battlefield. Ophelia was welcomed back from her long exile, finally given the respect and honor she had been denied for so many years, and she took on the role of formally training Alira in the deeper aspects of her abilities, ensuring the wards would remain strong for generations to come. Mira, overjoyed to learn that her closest friend had survived and returned, quickly became one of Alira's most trusted companions within the castle, helping her navigate the unfamiliar world of pack leadership with warmth and steady support. Corin, who had first uncovered the truth about Alira's bloodline, became one of her strongest allies among Kaidan's advisors, recognizing in her a partner whose wisdom would serve Blackmore well for years to come. Callan Thorne, humbled by his defeat, eventually sent formal word of surrender, relinquishing any further claims to Blackmore's territory and acknowledging Alira's right to choose her own path without interference. Whether Thornwild would remain a threat in the years ahead remained uncertain, but for now, peace settled over the northern territories, fragile but genuine. On a clear evening several months after the battle, Blackmore gathered once again in the Great Hall, the same space where Alira had once been humiliated in front of the entire court. This time, the atmosphere carried none of the cold cruelty of that earlier night. Instead, warmth and celebration filled the hall as Kaidan stood before his assembled kingdom, Alira at his side, both of them dressed in ceremonial attire befitting the occasion. "Many of you witnessed the night I made the greatest mistake of my life," Kaidan said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "I rejected a woman I did not understand, dismissed her worth, based on nothing more than ignorance and arrogance. Tonight, I stand before you to correct that mistake, not simply by reclaiming what fate once offered me, but by publicly recognizing the extraordinary strength, wisdom, and courage of the woman who saved this kingdom, when I had already failed her completely." He turned to Alira, taking her hand gently in his own, and the crowd watched in respectful silence as he continued. "Alira Voss, I ask you now, not as an alpha king commanding a mate, but as a man who has come to deeply respect and love you, whether you will stand beside me, as an equal partner in every sense, leading this kingdom together." Alira looked out across the crowd that had once watched her walk away in humiliation, and she felt no trace of the fear or shame that had gripped her that night. She felt, instead, a quiet, powerful confidence, the product of everything she had learned and overcome in the months since her departure. "I will," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hall, "not because fate demands it, but because I have chosen it, freely and completely, standing here as exactly who I am." The hall erupted into celebration, the same crowd that had once watched her rejection, now witnessing her triumphant return, and as Kaidan drew her into a gentle embrace, Alira felt, for the first time since that painful night so many months ago, that she had truly found where she belonged, not as someone defined by rejection or by the power others sought to claim from her, but as a woman who had built her own worth, on her own terms, and had finally found a partner willing to honor that truth completely. Outside the castle walls, the ancient wards continued their steady, quiet glow along the border, stronger than they had been in generations, a lasting testament to the strength of a woman who had once been dismissed as nothing, and who had ultimately become everything her kingdom needed her to be.